They say marriage is about trust, but trust flew right out the window the night paramedics stormed into my home with scissors, gloves, and an expression I'll never forget. Imagine two grown adults glued together in a way you only read about in those bizarre tabloid headlines, except this wasn't some joke. It was my cheating husband and his mistress, tangled like a couple of kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. The room reeked of humiliation, desperation, and just a hint of my own satisfaction. Tom, my husband of 12 years, was begging through gritted teeth, whispering, "Please, don't let them see me like this," while I stood at the corner pretending to be the distraught wife. If laughter truly is the best medicine, then the neighbors got a lifetime's prescription that night. Would you have stood your ground or walked away before it got this far? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emma met Tom in a season of her life when steady felt like safety and safety felt like love. I was that Emma, the one who worked double shifts at the clinic and still packed lunches with handwritten notes, the one who learned his coffee order by heart and pretended not to notice the way he lingered in mirrors. Tom enjoyed being seen, by me, by our neighbors, by anyone within earshot of his stories about closing deals and mentoring the new hires he insisted called him Coach. In our little town he was charming in a way that fooled most people and occasionally fooled me. I forgave the first string of late arrivals home because he brought flowers. I forgave the second string because he said the market was rough. By the third, I wasn't forgiving so much as negotiating with silence, convincing myself a good marriage was mostly endurance, with occasional fireworks on holidays. The cracks showed up first as whispers. He'd step out onto the porch with his phone, voice lowered, laugh held like a secret. The screen would flip face down the moment I entered the room, and the conversation would end with a sudden, polite, "I'll call you back." He said he didn't want me to worry about work chatter. I told myself that made sense. At night, when the house settled and the clock tapped rhythm in the hallway, he'd roll over with the glow of the phone reflected in his eyes. When I shifted, he'd slide it beneath the pillow and ask if I needed water. I learned the choreography of stepping aside, of smiling past discomfort. The truth is that people don't ignore signs because they're blind. They ignore them because the alternative is admitting your life isn't what you promised yourself it would be. The work trips arrived like uninvited guests, last-minute bookings, duffel tossed into the trunk, a kiss on the forehead that tasted like hurry. He always had a reason. A client was flying in. A regional meeting got moved. A mentor wanted a breakfast catch-up 3 states away. I kept a calendar on the pantry door, a neat column of destinations, Denver, Nashville, Charlotte, each a respectable city with respectable business. He'd send receipts, sometimes a photo of a steak or a skyline as proof of life. But the timing never felt right. The flights were late. The meetings were early. The gaps between messages stretched, then snapped back with a "busy day, I'll call later." It's funny how a suitcase can become a signal, packed with shirts and explanations, zipped around the parts of the story I wasn't allowed to see. People in love can be the last to hear what everyone else is already saying. My friends tried to be gentle. Over coffee, Layla stirred sugar like a metronome and said, "Men like him never stop needing applause." She didn't say, "Men like him never stop," full stop, because she loved me enough to leave room for miracles. Another friend asked if I felt cherished or just tolerated. I laughed it off, made a joke about Tom's loud laugh and louder friends, and promised we were fine. When your heart has built a home, you don't evacuate just because someone smelled smoke. You open windows, wave a dishcloth, and say the draft will clear it. It took longer than it should have for me to notice that fine was just a synonym for lonely, that my jokes were a second job, that I was working overtime to keep the image of us brighter than the reality. Small humiliations never come wearing a name tag. They stroll in acting like normal. My birthday came and went with a text that read, "Rain check, big pitch tomorrow." He posted a gym selfie that night with a caption about discipline while I ate supermarket cake at our kitchen island, held together by plastic wrap and optimism. At a neighbor's barbecue, Tom told a story about my signature lasagna being more signature than delicious, and the circle laughed, and I laughed too, but something in me folded up like a lawn chair. He flirted the way some people test microphones. "Just checking the connection," he'd say with a grin, waiting for strangers to reflect back to him the kind of man he preferred to be. I learned to carry napkins in my purse, not for spills, but for the moments I needed a place to put the pieces of my pride while I remembered how to smile. His mother once told me that Tom had always needed a spotlight. As a kid, he put on living room performances. As a teenager, he collected yearbook signatures like trophies. I used to think that meant he was confident. Later, I realized it meant he was hungry. He needed admiration the way other people need vitamins, and if one bottle ran low, he'd find another shelf. At home, his compliments arrived on a schedule like holidays you circle in pencil. In public, he worked rooms with open palms and jokes tailored to the crowd. I loved him. That is the part people sometimes miss when they watch a story like this from the outside. I loved him enough to believe we could course correct, enough to say, "We're in a rough patch," instead of "we're on the edge," enough to run interference between his ego and the people who might not find it charming. The night the phone call cut off mid-giggle, something in me stopped negotiating. I wasn't angry yet. I was awake. I walked into the living room and found him with that carefully blank expression he saved for when truth was a problem to be solved. He said it was a colleague, a joke, an inside reference I wouldn't get. He offered me a glass of wine and a movie. I accepted, because marriages are built from thousands of small decisions to keep talking, even when words feel like pebbles in your shoes. But I watched him more closely after that. I watched the way he'd preen before leaving, how the cologne lingered long after the front door shut, how his playlists shifted from country to something smoother. Suspicion doesn't always scream, sometimes it hums quietly in the corner, and you realize you've been dancing to it for months. I tried kindness first. I planned dinners. I sent him articles about putting the phone away at night. I wrote him a note that said, "I miss us," and tucked it into his briefcase between a pen and a promise he hadn't made yet. He texted a heart emoji in reply and came home late with a grin and a story about a last-minute meeting. When I suggested counseling, he said we were too busy. When I asked about scheduling quality time, he said we should be more spontaneous. It's remarkable how many ways a person can say, "I'm not showing up," while sounding reasonable. Some mornings I watched him in the mirror practicing his leadership speech for the quarterly update, and I wondered if the greatest audience he'd ever captivated was himself. There's a loneliness particular to standing inches from someone who lives 3 feet beyond reach. People will ask why I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt like admitting failure, because we had a mortgage and a history and a shared list of grocery store brands we always bought. I stayed because he wasn't a villain in every scene. Sometimes he was funny and tender, and the person who knew exactly how I took my tea. You can love someone's best 10 minutes and spend years paying for the other 50. The turning of the lock on our front door at night still felt like a ritual, a signal that the world could wait. I told myself seasons change, that men mellow with time, that commitment is mostly choosing. And then, at a charity gala we attended in borrowed confidence, I watched Tom lean too close to a woman with a jeweled clutch, complimenting her in a tone I knew too well, and the look she gave him wasn't interest so much as confirmation. I didn't cry. I counted the beats of the band and let the song end. A few days later, he missed our dinner reservation for what he called an emergency meeting. The waiter boxed up the food with a softness that felt like pity. On my way home, I passed the pharmacy, and I thought about adhesives and permanence and the strange comfort in things that refuse to come apart. I didn't wake up that morning planning revenge. I woke up planning to cook, to talk, to try again. But the steady accumulation of small cuts will eventually teach you where to place a single, precise line. In the quiet of our kitchen, I set down my purse, glanced at the pantry calendar with its cities and alibis, and realized that sympathy for myself had finally outrun patience for him. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. Truthfully, I felt calm. The kind of calm that arrives when the decision you've been avoiding walks into the room and sits down at your table. By then, friends had stopped warning and started watching. They knew I had learned the language of pretending and suspected I was practicing a new one. Layla asked me, "Do you feel small around him or just tired?" I told her tired, because small would have hurt to say out loud. She gave me a hug that said she'd hold my place if I needed to step out of my life for a minute, but I didn't step out. I stepped in. I took inventory of what I knew, what I suspected, and what I was ready to do. People think the big moments are where character shows. I think it's the small ones, the slow breath you take before you stop making excuses, the way your hand doesn't shake when you finally reach for your own dignity. If you've ever stood at that sink, staring at your reflection in the window while the streetlights hum, you know exactly what I mean. So let me be clear about the roles in this story. I was loyal, nurturing, and guilty of forgiving too many things that didn't deserve forgiveness. Tom was charming to the world and careless at home, a man who needed admiration the way a leaky boat needs bailing, desperately and constantly. If you're listening to this and recognizing someone you love, I understand the ache of that recognition. I also understand the moment you stop calling it a rough patch and start calling it disrespect. In marriages, disrespect is mold. It spreads quietly and ruins the foundations while everything looks fine on the surface. I didn't plan to be the person who taught Tom consequences. I planned to be the person who built a life with him. But when a person keeps choosing the mirror over the marriage, eventually the mirror is all they have left, and the rest of us finally choose ourselves. By the time Tom stopped pretending to be discreet, the shift was almost casual, like he believed secrecy was unnecessary because my silence had become permanent. He flaunted her openly, a woman whose presence at his side was justified with phrases like, "just a colleague," or "helping with client relations." Yet the way he adjusted his tie when she entered the room, the way his laugh deepened around her, left little space for doubt. I told myself to focus on the home, the routines, the commitments that held our lives together. But each time I caught them exchanging glances, I felt the weight of my own denial pressing harder. A man convinced of his invincibility will often test how far he can walk before the ground shifts beneath him. Tom walked further each day, confident I would not move, confident my loyalty was stronger than my dignity. The cruelty sharpened when he stopped reserving his arrogance for strangers and began using me as an example. One evening I heard him on the phone, his voice carrying just far enough for me to catch his words. He bragged to someone, whether it was his mistress or a friend didn't matter, that I would never leave him. "Emma's too weak," he chuckled. The sentence dropped like a verdict he considered final. The words lodged in me like glass. I stood, frozen, half hidden by the hallway wall, realizing he wasn't just dismissing me in private. He was building his own legend of invulnerability on the assumption that my silence was permanent. For a moment I wondered if I should interrupt, confront him, remind him that weakness and patience are not the same thing. But I didn't. I stayed still, listening as he reinforced his myth, and in my stillness I began to understand that his overconfidence was the very crack I could use. The breaking point came dressed as a celebration. At a dinner party filled with colleagues, neighbors, and acquaintances, Tom lifted his glass for a toast. He smiled that polished smile, the one people always said was charismatic, and declared, "Here's to freedom from boring wives." The laughter that followed was not hearty, not joyful. It was uncomfortable, edged with disbelief. Some guests chuckled softly, others shifted in their chairs, but the damage was done. I sat there, smiling as though the joke was harmless, as though I hadn't just been dismissed in front of an entire room. My cheeks burned, not from the wine, but from the humiliation that seeped deeper than any insult whispered behind closed doors. I watched him bask in the moment, proud of his performance, unaware that his cruelty was no longer just a private injury, but a public wound. What he didn't know was that each insult had been stacking like kindling, and every new act of mockery was another match drawn too close to the pile. Friends avoided my eyes at the table, shifting uncomfortably as though sympathy itself might embarrass me further. I stirred my glass, nodded at his punchlines, and swallowed not just the bitterness of the evening, but years of subtle degradations. Audiences watching might ask, "How much can she take?" And the truth is, I was asking myself the same question. Every marriage has moments that test patience, but this wasn't patience anymore. This was humiliation offered like a performance, and my silence wasn't agreement. It was the quiet before a decision. Tom saw laughter and assumed victory. What he missed was the steady construction of a breaking point. He could neither predict nor control. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day where routine disguises itself as stability. Tom had left in a rush, claiming another meeting across town, and for reasons I can't entirely explain, I felt compelled to use his car instead of mine. When I opened the passenger side door, something caught my eye. A shirt, half crumpled on the floorboard, carried a mark that froze me in place. A lipstick stain, bold in color, rested on the collar. Next to it, folded with careless haste, was a small note written in handwriting I didn't recognize. The words were simple, but sharp enough to slice through years of denial. Last night was perfect. Can't wait for more. My fingers trembled as I held both items, the proof I had avoided for too long now forcing me to confront a reality I could no longer dismiss. I walked into our living room with the shirt and the note in hand. When Tom arrived later that evening, still wearing the smile of someone who believed the world admired him, I dropped the shirt onto the coffee table. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. He glanced at it, then at me, and instead of shame or apology, a smirk stretched across his face. "You're still snooping through my things?" he asked, his tone casual, mocking. He laughed, as though my discovery was nothing more than an inconvenience he could charm his way past. To him, this was just another test of my endurance, another chance to reinforce the story he always told, that I was too soft, too loyal, too unwilling to walk away. But what Tom failed to see was the shift in my silence. My quiet was no longer the silence of someone accepting humiliation. It was the silence of someone measuring the cost and preparing to act. I looked at him, not with tears this time, but with clarity. Years of whispered phone calls, missed dinners, public insults and private dismissals converged into one undeniable conclusion. His arrogance had written a check that his life was about to cash. He mocked, he teased, he dismissed, but behind my steady gaze, something inside me snapped. I would no longer be the supporting character in his story. From that moment, he was standing on ground he believed was solid, but the cracks beneath him had already begun to widen. Once the proof sat in my hands, the decision no longer felt like a question, but an answer that had been waiting for its moment. Tom had built a legend of invincibility, convinced that no matter how reckless he became, I would remain the quiet wife in the background. What he underestimated was how carefully a quiet woman can plan once her silence shifts into resolve. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten, I didn't even argue. Instead, I studied him with a calm that unnerved even me. And in that stillness, the outline of justice began to form. His arrogance had thrived because he believed he controlled the script. He believed I would endure endlessly. But this time, I was writing the ending. Tom's habits had become predictable. He was preparing for another late-night meeting, the kind that ended not in conference rooms, but in dim apartments or cheap hotel suites. He had his usual bag of excuses lined up, but I had his routine memorized. That's when the plan took shape. The bottle he so carelessly kept for his private indulgences became my canvas for justice. I replaced the contents with something far less forgiving, super glue, subtle, odorless, waiting for him and his companion to walk straight into a consequence they could neither explain nor escape. It wasn't rage that guided me, it was precision, the knowledge that he would only learn the weight of humiliation when it unfolded in front of an audience he could not control. The trap worked without hesitation. Hours later, the neighborhood stirred awake to a noise no one could ignore. Their screams tore through the walls, raw and panicked, the sound of two people bound together by more than betrayal. Windows lit up as neighbors peeked through blinds. Phones appeared, recording, whispering voices layering over the chaos. Some gasped, others laughed nervously, and within minutes word spread beyond the street. The spectacle no one imagined possible was unfolding in real time, and the man who once held himself above ridicule was now reduced to pleading cries in front of flashing lights and watchful eyes. By the time paramedics arrived, their struggle had already become a show. The very man who mocked me in public, who toasted to freedom from boring wives, was now begging strangers not to look at him. His voice cracked under the pressure of humiliation, repeating words that carried no authority anymore. Please, don't let them see me like this. But there was no curtain to fall, no crowd to disperse. Cameras were rolling, whispers were multiplying, and the image of Tom's downfall was cementing itself into the collective memory of everyone watching. His reputation, once his proudest possession, collapsed faster than the flashing lights faded from the street. The mistress, once proud to be paraded in front of me, fled the aftermath in shame. Her name became a cautionary whisper, her presence a reminder that arrogance borrowed never lasts. Tom, stripped of dignity, faced consequences sharper than any insult he had ever dished out. His public mockery, his careless jokes, his cruel dismissals, all of them came back amplified, 10 times heavier, until he was crushed beneath the weight of his own arrogance. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to argue. The justice was delivered not by my hands alone, but by the very stage he had built for himself. And as I stood apart, watching the scene unfold, there was no triumph in my heart, only closure. For every year I had endured humiliation, he now endured it in minutes that felt like eternity. For every insult that cut quietly into me, he was now torn open in front of neighbors, colleagues, and strangers who would never forget. Justice had finally arrived, and it carried the sound of his cries echoing into the night. By the time the chaos subsided and the flashing lights of the ambulance faded down the street, Tom's life was no longer the one he had so carefully curated. In the days that followed, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into judgment that no amount of charm could erase. His reputation, once the foundation of his pride, was shattered. Friends who had once filled our dinner table with laughter avoided his calls. Business partners, wary of association, distanced themselves quietly, leaving him to navigate the ruins of a career that had been built more on bravado than substance. The man who once strutted through every room certain of admiration now struggled to step outside without feeling the sting of curious eyes. His legend of invincibility dissolved, leaving behind a man reduced not by accident, but by his own arrogance. For me, the aftermath was not about revenge, it was about reclamation. I stood taller, not because of what had happened to him, but because I had finally chosen myself. Neighbors who once pitied my silence now offered supportive words, their sympathy no longer tinged with doubt but with respect. I found strength not in the humiliation Tom endured, but in the dignity I reclaimed. Where once I had been defined by his shadow, I now walked in my own light. The pain of betrayal had been deep, but the lesson was deeper still. No amount of loyalty should require the sacrifice of one's self-respect. Cruelty breeds humiliation, but dignity survives. Those words became a truth I carried with me, a reminder that silence is not weakness when it leads to wisdom, and patience is not surrender when it builds resolve. When betrayal runs deep, justice doesn't always come from courts. It comes from within, from the quiet decision to stop accepting less than you deserve. Tom learned that lesson in the harshest way imaginable, and while his downfall echoed loudly, my recovery grew quietly, steadily, into something stronger than what he ever believed I could be. So I ask you now, what would you have done in this situation? Would you have endured a little longer, or would you have drawn the line sooner? Share your thoughts, because every choice has its cost, and every silence has its breaking point. And as this story closes, remember this. In the end, arrogance crumbles, but dignity survives.